afternoon, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. I hope you're all well. This episode today is about black-eyed children, a subject that totally freaks me out. So these are some stories that I've found around the internet and I hope you enjoy them. In January 2016, a Vermont woman reported that she actually let black-eyed children into her home. A little over a year prior, a blizzard was ravaging the world outside her door, so she was very surprised to hear a loud knock on it. Figuring someone probably crashed their car trying to navigate the weather, she made her way to the door and peeked out the window. There was no car. She described a feeling of dread wash over her for reasons she couldn't understand. The banging continued, so she decided to wake her husband to let him answer instead. Two small children were on the other side of the door, and they were not dressed appropriately for the storm. The woman and her husband let the little boy and girl inside, despite the great sense of unease their presence made them feel, and regretted it almost instantly. One cat hissed while the other three hid, unusual behaviour for them all, and it didn't seem to matter what the woman asked them. What happened? Are you lost? Want some cocoa? The answer was always the same. Our parents will be here soon. She made them cocoa anyway, and when she returned with the mugs, that's when she noticed their eyes. They were completely jet black, with no whites at all, just giant black pupils. They asked for the bathroom and she directed them to it. Then everything happened all at once. Her husband's nose started bleeding, the power went out, and as she rushed to get a tissue, she was confronted by both children staring at her from the hall. Our parents are here. They then walked out the front door. She watched as the creepy children got into a black car with two very tall men in suits. They left. Within months of the encounter, 3 of their 4 cats went missing. The 4th, the one that hissed, was found in a pool of blood, dead from a hemorrhage. Her husband's nosebleeds continued and he was eventually diagnosed with skin cancer, despite spending little time outdoors. The woman began suffering from chronic nosebleeds as her husband initially had, and her health began slowly deteriorating. She is certain it's because of the black-eyed children. John Northwood was heading to his car on the 3rd floor of a parking garage when one of the guys from the conference he'd just attended, Doug, asked him to drive him round the block a few times. He said there were some freaky-looking kids hanging round his car and was hoping to kill some time while he waited for them to wander off. John let Doug in and they started cruising. When they neared his car, John saw the group Doug was talking about and agreed they were creepy. 3 kids, 2 boys and a girl, all gothed out. The girl looked about 15, the boys around 14 and 10. They were intense, but John described it as if he really needed to look at them. He stopped driving. The kids manoeuvred around his car and the youngest one said, "It's scary out there all alone and we just wanted a ride home." One said Doug had offered them a ride home, which he denied. John felt as if his heart was going to erupt from his throat as adrenaline raced through him. Doug said he was getting out of the car. As soon as he reached for the handle, it was like the children got older somehow and he saw their eyes were solid black. No pupil, no iris, nothing. Just black. John threw the car into reverse and drove backwards about 60 feet. The kids began to pursue them, so John took the car around the lot's corners going around 30 miles per hour. He felt that they would die if he let those kids into the car. He sped down 3 floors only to find the oldest boy was already at the bottom of the garage when they came out. They sped past him out of the garage. When John turned around, the boy was gone, and so was that menacing feeling that had been building up inside him since making contact with those kids. They waited 10 minutes before going back to Doug's car. The black-eyed children were nowhere in sight. It was then that Doug admitted he had given the younger kid a ride earlier, but felt scared when he saw the older kid. Upon leaving the garage for the 2nd time that night, the menacing feeling returned. John was behind Doug's car, watching helplessly as he misjudged the time it would take to get through the intersection on a yellow light. Doug was struck by a truck and died instantly. The police arrived and John gave his report, feeling uneasy the whole time. Only then did he look around and see the black-eyed children staring, standing 2 blocks away. A gas station attendant in northeast Louisiana had a terrifying encounter in November 2012. The gas station was creepy enough to begin with at 3 a.m, but then the power went out. Led by the light of his cell phone, the attendant was able to get the generators going, but the backup lighting was dim and only lit up certain areas, like the cash area and the parking lot, while the rest of the isolated establishment was cloaked in black. Out in that darkness he noticed movement. 3 children on bikes were heading his way. They stood at the door and stared at the attendant. He felt creeped out, but they were just kids and it was way too late for them to be out. He opened the door and asked if they were okay. The young girl asked to use a phone, but as he handed his cell over to her, he realised her eyes were all black. "No, I need the real one," she pointed at the landline inside. The thought of letting her inside sent chills up his spine. He shouted at all of them to leave as he slammed and locked the door. The children stood there a bit longer, silently staring at him through the glass with their solid black eyes. Then they got back on their bikes and disappeared back into the darkness. The next morning, the attendant was eager to go through the surveillance footage. Unfortunately, the power outage cut the cameras off and they didn't boot back up with the generator. He had nothing to prove the events of the night before took place. The next 2 accounts come from thoughtcatalogue.com, and I thought they'd be really interesting to include here as one of them's from the perspective of a child. On March the 17th, 2008, I had my one and only encounter with a black-eyed kid. Before my experience, I'd never heard of anything having to do with the black-eyed kids. I was 12. I was sitting outside a hairdresser's in an old Chevy pickup, waiting for my mum to get her hair cut. About 15 minutes had passed and I saw some kid walking back and forth along the sidewalk in front of my parked car. At first I thought I recognised him as one of my friends from school, so I banged on the front windshield until he looked my way. It was not anyone I knew. At this point I was not scared at all. Not yet. The boy walked over to the side of my car and just stares. I think to let me get a good look at his eyes, to freak me out. Let me tell you, if you've never seen a black-eyed kid, you have no idea what to imagine. Eyes black as the night sky. The boy whispers, "You must let me in." And then I locked the car doors and ducked down into the space below the seats. 5 minutes later he was gone. When my mother got back into the car, she told me a boy with black eyes had come into the hairdresser's and insisted for my mother to give him the keys to the car. She refused. Thank God she did. Yesterday I noticed my neighbour hadn't put out all his Halloween decorations, lights, etc. The past 2 years I've lived next to him, he's gone all out for Halloween. I don't know him well. He's younger, single, but I know he likes kids, and not in a creepy way. His brother and sister-in-law and their kids are always visiting him, and he plays with his 3 young nieces and nephews out in the yard. So anyway, I got home from work and was walking up my driveway and I saw him outside and said something like, "Hey man, you better get your Halloween stuff up or that house up the street is going to beat you for best decorations." He kind of smiles sheepishly and says that he's actually going to keep his house dark this year and just put candy out. I asked if he was going out of town, but he said no. Something happened last year that really scared him. Now I was concerned for my own safety if some weirdos were coming round our neighbourhood, which is a pretty safe neighbourhood with tons of young families living here, so I asked him what happened. He said last year his brother's family had come over so they could trick-or-treat in the neighbourhood, since they live in an apartment complex that doesn't do much for Halloween. He had a bunch of kids come to the door like always. His family took off around 10:30 p.m. and there were only a few older trick-or-treaters, but by 11:30 they were pretty much done. So he was inside watching TV and the doorbell rings. He grabs the candy bowl and heads over, noticing that it's a little past midnight and that's pretty rude for trick-or-treaters to still be out. But then he notices he hasn't turned off all his decoration lights yet, so his house is still a beacon. He swings the door open and is about to yell "boo" or something to freak them out, but stops dead when he sees the kids at the door. He said one was probably around 13-14 and the other around 16-17, both boys. They weren't dressed up, but he remembers the older one was wearing a flannel checkered shirt. He was immediately overcome with uneasiness, like opening the door was a huge mistake. They just stared at him, and he noticed they had really big irises and dilated pupils. He couldn't even see the whites of their eyes, so he figured they were contact lenses. He was frozen there holding the candy bowl, like he couldn't slam the door in their face as much as he wanted to. So he nervously tried to smile at them, hoping they would break character and ask for candy or something. The younger one said they'd gotten lost and needed to come in and use his phone. That was when he closed the door more than halfway on them and said, "No, sorry." And the older one said something like, "Can we just wait in your house until our parents come get us?" But by then he was convinced that his life was in danger, and these kids must be high on something or intending to rob him, and he just kept mumbling, "No, sorry, good night," as he inched the door closed and locked it. He told me he was so effing scared at that point that they were going to try and break in through one of his windows or something, but he looked through the peephole and they'd turned to leave. He watched TV with the volume really low so he could hear any sounds at all, and he stayed up till like 5 a.m. because he was too scared to go to bed and drop his guard. The whole time he's telling me this, I'm thinking, oh my God, this sounds so familiar, just like the Black-Eyed Kids urban legend. Then I thought, hey, maybe this dude is trying to scare me because after all, he does have the Halloween spirit. So I'm looking at him incredulously, but trying not to seem too gullible. So I'm like, man, that is really crazy, sounds like the Black-Eyed Kids. He looks at me blankly. The what? Is that a movie or something? I said no, but told him to go look it up online. Like an hour later, I get a knock on my door, and admittedly almost jump out of my skin thinking it's a demon child. It was my neighbour, and his eyes were freaking huge. He swears to me up and down that he had never heard of the Black-Eyed Kids before, and it's so similar to what happened to him. So we talked a while longer, and I told him that quite a few people probably know about that urban legend, and it's possible it was just teenagers with black scleral contacts trying to freak people out on Halloween, which would be genius, by the way. But he said that the fear he felt was so primal and came over him the second he opened the door for them. And those are your Black-Eyed Kids stories for this episode. Hope you enjoyed them. Just as a matter of interest, as I was recording the audio for the part where he says he closes and locks the door, there was a massive clatter in the corner of my living room behind the telly. I don't know what it was. I got up and had a look. There's nothing out of place. Nothing's fallen down. I even went into the man cave because the wall adjoins this wall, and there's nothing out of place in there. I've been in and out of there all morning. There's nothing out of place in there, so I have absolutely no idea what it is. I sent the clip to Andy Booth, and he rang me straight back and said, "Listen through your headphones. It sounds like a padlock on a door." So I don't know what it was, but it was nothing physical in this room. So if you have a listen, see what you think, leave a comment, and I shall see you next time. Thanks for tuning in. Take care, everybody. Bye. But by then he was convinced that his life was in danger, and these kids must be high on something, or intending to rob him, and he just kept mumbling, "No, sorry, good night," as he inched the door closed and locked it. He told me he was so effing... What the fuck was that?